Hello, Wake Up New Zealand, Carol Seki speaking. The Labour-led government and their complete failings. I believe we are at the stage of the government leading us down the path of plundering of New Zealand, of a communist degrowth, and intentionally so. So some of the problems that I see, huge problems in New Zealand that I see that need attending to running up to the election that parties need to be talking about are the following. I know that emergency services, some political parties have talked about increasing funding for emergency services. Now, let's look at that. The cost of calling an ambulance is almost $100. I paid almost $100 to call an ambulance a few weeks back. So how many people can actually afford that can do that? St John's, however, is funded approximately 80% through contracts with the Ministry of Health and the Accident Compensation Corporation. The shortfall is made up from ambulance park charges, third-party contract, and fundraising. The fire service, fire and emergency, is funded by levies through property insurance. If you insure your house and your contents, some portion of your insurance actually goes to pay for fire and emergency services. What about doctors and nurses? Many of them crossing the ditch for a better life for themselves and their families. Actually, they're crossing the ditch in droves. So we've got a shortage of doctors and nurses. They want better conditions. New Zealand's not given them those better conditions. So this has been reported on newzealanddoctor.com. And what about the aged care sector? I'm really concerned about this because end-of-life choice bill, put that word choice in, it's getting into the head stuff. It has very dangerous concepts, and no one knows, that no doctor knows what goes on behind closed doors for a person that might mean they just want to end their life right now. They may feel they're a burden on society. You don't know. So there's huge dangerous concepts in that. And having hospice services that are very lightly funded doesn't help at all. So when you're looking at aged care, right now, they are New Zealand Aged Care Association Deputy President Warren Dunn says there are around 1,000 nursing shortages. Our sector is a nursing-led service, so having sufficient workforce is critical. So they reported that they're 1,200 beds short. So aged care services, now the health service can't function as we're meant to. The government isn't putting money into it as they promised. Aged care in New Zealand looks really grim. And what about hospital waiting lists? 67,000 people in New Zealand are waiting on hospital waiting lists. Middlemore, people in ED are waiting more than 6 hours to see a doctor. 37,000 New Zealanders waiting 4 months or longer for a first-time appointment to see a specialist. Think what that's doing to people's health while they are waiting. Increased hospice funding, what I was on about before, because I support hospice, because I know they also support the family of the patient, and they provide a huge service, the whole well-being of the patient. They provide the medication also. So they're grossly underfunded by the government. In lockdown, they lost even more funding because they couldn't open their hospice shop where they get a lot of their funding from. So they provide a brilliant service for patients and their families, providing medication, counselling and support services and home visits. So the national attention on this, there isn't any. Underfunding situation is faced by all 32 hospices across the country. They're surviving on selling second-hand goods to the burden on community to fit the bill. So there's a big lack of attention on palliative care. It's really important. We need to have the choice if we want to have palliative care. And we're having that choice taken away from us because of their underfunding. So overall, the hospice sector has a whopping 81 million shortfall every year, and they get a one-off payment from the government of 3.1 million granted. That's just a drop in the bucket, people. That is very serious. The issue for me is that more people end up on end-of-life choice, assisted suicide, and without this service, and ending their life without dignity, whereas a hospice is about living in dignity and dying in dignity. So, I think I know that's really, really important. So, and important to the health system, where more people who are in hospital could actually do with the system, which would alleviate some of the nurses in the hospitals also. It's an essential service. Right? So as for education, we need to revamp the whole education system, because our young people, our children, are failing miserably. Education is being dumbed down. Children are being politicised and sexualised. And all their schooling, their school curriculum, is actually coming from the UN, UNESCO. Parents' rights need to be put more in focus. They are being just ignored, really, and many students haven't returned back to school after lockdowns. So the other thing is, New Zealand is the name of our country. It's on the globe. If you buy a globe, New Zealand. If you look at a world map, New Zealand. We are not called Aotearoa. Aotearoa is a very pretty name. It's very pretty indeed. But it's not officially our name. So, the taxpayers of New Zealand, 120 MPs we have to financially support in Parliament. And when leaders like Ardern actually leave their role of Parliament, being the leader of the country, the Prime Minister, she leaves, not only do we support her when she's left, but we support her partner as well. I believe we can do with many less MPs in Parliament. Have you noticed when there's important bills and that going through, you'd be lucky to get half the politicians there half the time, and then you get the smarty remarks. They're worse than kids in play school. They're like children arguing in the playground. They're worse. So, that needs to stop. We're talking about the managing of our country for the people of New Zealand. Citizens-initiated binding referendums. We don't have a citizens-initiated binding referendum. So the government are not bound to our decision-making rights. We have no decision-making rights. We cannot determine what happens in our country. The government has binding and non-binding. They choose what they have. So even if you had 3/4 of the country saying, look, this is what we want, it's the end decision-making rights belong to the MPs in the toilet bowl of Wellington. So people, no matter what you put forward in your policies, etc., you do need to have a citizens-initiated binding referendum. The people of New Zealand deserve a voice. This is their country. This government is here to serve them. We are not there to serve their communist ideology. So what about these significant natural areas, the SNAs? Well, I've got big concerns around that as they replaced the Resource Management Act 1991 with 3 new legislations. And this will actually be a huge concern for a lot of people. So we're talking about private properties. So we're looking at not just farmland, we're talking about residential properties as well. So restriction and reclassification of residential properties. The council using aerial photos, mapping, visits of council staff. Oh, by the way, if they do, they have to get your permission to come onto your property. So certain unelected iwi Māori will determine what Indigenous vegetation is on your property, whether you must actually look after it, you're not allowed to remove it, you might have to get consent, resource consent to actually remove it, but if the council and the iwi say no, the iwi have the right to say no, then you may have to pay for someone to actually come and deal with that for you, an ecologist. And that can cost you a lot of money, up to $30,000. So, and then you have certain iwi Māori that say the land they own, that is general land, their land should be exempt from this. And they have customary rights to go onto land to take this Indigenous vegetation. But the policies don't describe whether this land is Māori land, Crown land, or residential land, privately owned. And this is what's happening in New Zealand. Some farmers, like for instance, one had 170 hectares of land, has been told he can only use 70 hectares. But don't forget, the land you can't use, you still pay rates on. This is daylight robbery. This is land grabbing. This is robbery. So council staff want to come on private property, they must get permission, and so must iwi Māori. And they are collaborating with local and central government. SNA is a huge one, and it's a massive problem. And no one is talking about it when they are talking about their policy making. So we need to stop this. This is taking away your private property rights. You pay rates on land that you can't use? Come on, people, this is your land. It's an attack on property owners. So the draft national policy for Indigenous diversity objectives and policies restore, manage Indigenous biodiversity, enhance ecology, integrity of the ecosystem, tighten restrictions on landowners, attack property owners. So iwi Māori can say their land through policy is to be protected on general land titles, but Māori iwi land to be exempt. So government's overall strategy, Te Moana, Te Teo, Aotearoa, New Zealand biodiversity strategy, partnering with government on decisions around land, sea, waterways, and air. Asserting, embedding the treaty partnership. There was no partnership. So, Treaty Waitangi. In order to strengthen the treaty partnership between Maori and Crown, support local government and iwi. Te mana o te tea. A definition of tonga is explained in the government policy statement: Indigenous species, populations or ecosystems that are identified by tangata whenua or tonga, that Maori exercise the full role of rangatira, boss, master, owner, kaitiaki, our guardianship. Treaty partners, whānau, iwi, hapu and Maori organisations are central to the biodiversity system, are recognised as leaders. This is in the policy. So the policy directs councils to work with iwi Maori to define a process for identifying Indigenous species and ecosystems. Councils at their directions must make changes to council plans to include the description of identified tonga and their values on the map of location. Your property must be mapped out for this reason. So it must provide opportunities for tangata whenua to exercise kaitiatanga over Indigenous biodiversity, allowing tangata whenua to take Indigenous vegetation for customary use. But government policies do not distinguish whether this is in Crown-owned land, Maori-owned land or privately owned land. So this is what it is. A property owner could be asked for the vegetation to be improved upon, to be embraced. And if you disagree against the council and iwi, the ecologist would be required. This could cost up to $30,000 to act on property owners' behalf. This is a minefield. The robbing of ratepayer infrastructure too. Is well known that ratepayers are being robbed of the infrastructure that they are being paid, that they have paid for. That's another issue. What about the methane emission, the cow farts and belches? That's another one. No farmers, no food. It will affect you. So all part of the authoritarian government of New Zealand, engineering your behaviour and demanding what you eat. Auckland Council, C40 cities, plant-based diet. The ratepayers have already paid for research on plant-based foods. You are paying for that out of your rates. Crisis control. UN now advising UN member nation climate change is at desperation point. The actions that UN nations, member nations' actions must be stronger and bolder with their populations, with the people in their countries. Stop co-governance, critical race theory, cultural Marxism, identity politics has no place in New Zealand. That's apartheid. Remove critical race theory from schools. No children, young person should have to apologise for their colour of their skin, and I don't care what colour it is. They shouldn't have to apologise for it or feel guilty and ashamed. This is separatism and division. This is apartheid. Now, the C+ International WHO, World Health Organization, International Pandemic Treaty. That's getting well on the way as they're planning that. Helen Clark, co-chair. Recently, Jacinda Ardern visited her at the World Health Assembly, where they are working on this pandemic treaty. The goal is to give mass power to the World Health Organization to determine restrictions, lockdowns, technology, etc., mass power over every nation in the world, every person in the world, not just every person, because this includes the One Health approach framework. That's control of humans, animals, domestic, wild, and all ecosystem. That's land, water, air, everything. And complete control of that. And many countries are behind that. And New Zealand government is behind this, and they are promoting it. Crisis and control. Now you've got co-governance, radical activists, Seeger, Christian heroised Seeger, who's targeting Julian Batchelor, who's travelling around New Zealand to stop co-governance, stop apartheid in New Zealand. Well, Seeger, let's look at him. He is a key person in Vegetarian Society of Aotearoa. He made a documentary that's gone to International Film Awards called Milk, and he wants all dairy and all meat gone from New Zealand. Now, he's been talking on Maori radio stations that are actually funded by the government. Mainstream media has been supporting him, interviewing him, getting him out there, him and his partner. Supported by the Journalist Fund, the government supporting this. He is pro-plant-based food. Get rid of dairy and meat in New Zealand. Supported by the government. So, Auckland City Council supporting Extinction Rebellion. And that's what they're doing. That's what they were doing in 2019. They were locked into BP office, Auckland office as part of their Extinction Rebellion protest. Banned indoors, covered walls with slogans, shouting, chanting, and they're well known for this. They call it civil disobedience. They upset people's lives. They upset transport. They upset civil people who are law-abiding citizens who are trying to get on with their day. That's what they do. They cause as much disruption, civil disruption, as possible. And I see that they are very involved with the council. And they've done untold damage overseas, and they say that they are a part of this overseas big protests, etc., and they intend to keep on doing this. So they started off in Auckland in 2018. So, going back to Seeger, he's the co-founder of Liberation League of Aotearoa against plant-based foods. Therefore promotes C40 cities, Auckland City, C40 City, the Vegetarian Society of Aotearoa. He's a key person there. Now, they have invited Dunedin to mayor, that Dunedin become the first plant-based city in New Zealand. Sister city of Edinburgh, which is the first capital in Europe to be called the first plant-based city, having signed the plant-based treaty, where they actually have days where no one is in schools, hospitals, etc., are allowed to eat meat. Meat is not on the menu. So this is what's happening, and Auckland City are right behind the plant-based diet. So it's working on the farmers from the inside out, because all the big populations are in the city urban areas. That's where they eat the most food, they consume the most food. So it's about destroying farmers no farmers, no food, from the inside out. And it's been done purposely so. And Extinction Rebellion, SIGA are all part of this. So what about local and central government? Should we have non-elected entities there? People? Organisations? I don't think so. I know we should not. If we didn't elect them to be in that position to represent the people of New Zealand, then they should not be there. And that needs to end. So all political cronies in the cesspit of Wellington are well aware of everything I talk about. They are well aware that the UN are looking at a global hate speech international law. They are talking about it now for UN nations to introduce this into their legislations, into policies, etc. There is no official word there's no official definition of hate speech. So it's incitement to discrimination, incitement to violations, etc. So even on just incitement to discrimination, think about that one, how it can be used against people. Because what I think may be discrimination to me may not be discrimination to you. So people choose themselves. But those that choose, hey, that's discrimination to me, will be on the side of government. They will be the climate doom and gloomers. They will be LGBT. They will not be the farmers. They will not be those who are supporting those in aged care, the voluntary sector. It will not be the doctors who are speaking out the truth to their patients. And remember, those doctors that have been suspended for speaking out during the pandemic, those that have been suspended through the Medical Council, remember that Ben Gully, the lawyers who actually were those that were part of the agreement between Pfizer and the government, that a member of Ben Gully is on the Medical Council. Our corrupt government. I call this communist degrowth, the deliberate determining of the plundering of New Zealand. So those who are aiming to campaign as members of Parliament this year, please think about those things I have said. They're all very important, particularly the citizens-initiated binding referendum, because that gives the people of New Zealand a voice. Wake up, New Zealand.